She was not supposed to be here. That was the thought that struck Mrs. Hollis, housekeeper of Blackmere House for 22 years, as she watched the young woman step down from the carriage in the grey morning light. Not the eldest daughter of the Fairfax dynasty, not the golden-haired, bright-eyed creature the Duke had been seen dancing with twice at the Pembridge ball, and once at Lady Weston's assembly, and whose name had been circulating through every drawing-room in 3 counties as the woman who would finally restore the Blackmere fortune. No. This was someone else entirely. She was dressed in a slate-blue pelisse that had clearly been put on in a hurry, with a small leather satchel clutched against her side and an expression so composed it looked like something she had built rather than something she was born with. Mrs. Hollis pressed herself back against the wall of the entrance hall and said a small, private prayer. Inside the study, Edmund Ashby, 8th Duke of Blackmere, stood at the window with his second cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching the same woman cross his drive. He had been awake since 4 a.m., which wasn't something new. Since his father's ruin 15 years ago, sleep had become something other men did. He had spent the early hours of this particular morning going over the estate accounts for the 3rd time that week, as though the numbers might have changed overnight, as though the total at the bottom of the page might have rearranged itself into something more survivable. Unfortunately, it had not. The number was still the same. It was always the same. And today was supposed to be the day that changed. He watched the woman reach his front steps, and realized that she was not Clara Fairfax. He set the cold coffee down. He met her in the entrance hall because there was no time to do anything else, no time to have a room prepared, no time to change from his riding clothes, no time to arrange his face into something more ducal and less exhausted. He stood at the bottom of the staircase in his black coat and his worn hessians, and he looked at the young woman who stood on his threshold in the grey morning light, and he waited. She met his eyes without flinching. Hers were pale, grey-green, the colour of the estates lake in winter, and they were absolutely steady. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried. "My name is Miss Harriet Fairfax. I am Clara's younger sister, and I have a letter." She held it out. He crossed the hall and took it from her hand. Their fingers did not touch, she made certain of it. He read it standing in the hall, in full view of her, because he did not think to move. He read it once, and then he read it again, and then he folded it along its original crease before looking up at her. Clara Fairfax had eloped. Sometime in the small hours of this morning, she had climbed out of whatever window was most convenient, ran to wherever a Scottish poet had been waiting with a hired carriage, and had gone north. She'd gone north and left this woman, this composed, watchful, dark-haired woman, to manage the wreckage. He looked at Harriet Fairfax for a long moment, and thought about the 15 years. He thought about the number at the bottom of the page. He thought about his father's face in the portrait at the end of the gallery, and the way that face had looked in the months before the end, bewildered, diminished, and robbed of everything. "You're not what I ordered," he said. It was not meant as cruelty. It was simply the truth, stated in the only register he had left at 6:30 in the morning after a sleepless night and a letter that had just dismantled the only plan he had. But he watched the words land and he saw, just for a fraction of a second, so brief he might have imagined it, something move behind those winter-lake eyes. She did not let it show anywhere else. Her hand went to the pocket of her pelisse and withdrew a ring, his ring, the Blackmere engagement ring that his solicitor had delivered to Fairfax House a fortnight ago, and she crossed to the silver letter tray on the hall table. She set it down with a small, precise sound, like a period placed at the end of a sentence. Then she curtsied, and quite simply, without saying a word, walked back to the carriage that brought her, and got in.
And if that first scene just stopped your breath, if you felt the exact weight of that ring hitting the silver tray, then you are exactly where you're supposed to be. Welcome to the Duchess Library, where every page holds a treasure. If you are new here, then hit that subscribe button right now because you cannot afford to miss what is coming next. Like this video, and share it with someone who loves a story with real bones to it. This tale has betrayal, buried secrets, a crumbling estate, 11 letters that will change everything, and 2 people who are going to fight their way toward each other in the most gloriously stubborn fashion you have ever witnessed. So settle in, dear readers, because the Duke of Blackmere is about to discover that the wrong Miss Fairfax was the only right thing that ever walked through his door.
The door of Blackmere House closed behind Harriet Fairfax with a sound that Edmund Ashby felt somewhere below his sternum, in the region where, 15 years ago, something had calcified into the habit of not feeling things. He stood in his entrance hall with the folded letter in one hand and looked at the ring on the silver tray and did not move for quite some time. Mrs. Hollis appeared from the direction of the kitchen corridor, her hands folded, her expression that of a woman who has something to say and is calculating the odds of survival if she says it. He looked at her. She said nothing, but her eyes moved, very deliberately, to the window, to the drive, to where the wheels of the Fairfax carriage could still be heard on the gravel. "Fetch Mart," said the Duke, and walked back to his study. Gerald Mart arrived at Blackmere House at 9:30, which was remarkable, given that his offices were 12 miles away and nobody had sent for him until 7. He came because he had been expecting to be sent for since 6, when he had woken with the particular unease of a man who has arranged too many things that depend on other people behaving sensibly. He let himself into the study without knocking, a liberty the Duke permitted him and no one else, and found Edmund standing at the window again. The cold coffee had been replaced by a fresh cup that was also going cold. The ring from the silver tray in the hall had been moved to the corner of the desk, where it sat catching the grey morning light with a particular insolence of small objects placed in impossible situations. Mart set his leather case on the chair, opened it with his usual unhurried precision, and began removing papers. Account ledgers, settlement terms, outstanding debt schedules. He arranged them on the desk in the order that would tell the story most efficiently, and then he clasped his hands behind his back and waited. "She was here," the Duke said, without turning from the window. "Yes," said Mart. "Miss Harriet Fairfax. The second daughter." "The wrong daughter." "That," said Mart, carefully, "depends entirely on what document you consult." He moved one of the papers forward on the desk, the settlement terms, drafted by the Fairfax family solicitor 3 weeks prior. The fortune is listed under the Fairfax family name. It does not specify which daughter delivers it. Edmund turned from the window. His expression was the one Mart privately called the accounting face, the expression of a man running numbers on a human situation and not yet arriving at a result he liked. "She took the ring off herself," Edmund said. "Yes. You told her she was not what you ordered." A pause. "I told her the truth." "You told her a truth," Mart said, with the equanimity of a man whose job had required him to remain calm through a great many ducal moods over 2 decades. "There are several truths available in this situation. The truth that she is not the woman you courted. The truth that the estate cannot survive another season without an influx of capital. The truth," he allowed a brief pause here, the kind that carried weight, "that the woman who just walked out of your front door came here this morning knowing exactly what she was walking into, and she stood in your entrance hall and she handed that ring back with more composure than most men I know could summon at their best." Edmund looked at him. "She came here to manage a disaster," Mart continued, pulling his spectacles from his breast pocket and settling them on his nose with the air of a man returning to business. "Her sister eloped and left her to handle the consequences. She did so. She handled them precisely and without any apparent expectation of gratitude." He picked up the settlement papers and held them out. "Now, the fortune." Edmund took the papers. He read them. The silence in the study was the particular silence of a man running out of arguments against a thing he does not want to do, and discovering, one by one, that his objections have no legal standing. "She is in Bath," Mart said, after a suitable interval. "Her aunt's house on the Belverton Crescent. She left this morning and, given the state of the roads, will arrive by Thursday." "You already know where she is." "I made inquiries. It seemed prudent." Mart closed his case with a soft click. "I would suggest, Your Grace, that you do not wait until Friday." Edmund set the papers down. He looked at the ring on the corner of his desk. He thought about the number at the bottom of the page, and then he thought about something else, the fraction of a second in the entrance hall, so brief he might have imagined it. He had not imagined it. He was not the sort of man who imagined things. "She will not make it easy," he said. "No," Mart agreed, with something that was not quite a smile. "I expect she will not." He went after her. Not immediately. Immediately would have been too easy, and Harriet Fairfax, he was beginning to understand, was a woman who would see through anything that came too easily. He waited 3 days. He spent those 3 days going over the estate in a way he had not done in years, riding the grounds, speaking with the tenants, standing in rooms that had been closed for a decade and looking at what 15 years of managed decline actually looked like when you forced yourself to see it properly. The cracked cornicing. The bare patches on the carpets. The east wing that could not be opened because the roof above it had been leaking since his father's time and there had never been enough money to repair it. He thought about his father. He thought about a man who had trusted completely, who had handed the management of his family's wealth to a business partner and turned his attention elsewhere, and who had discovered, too late, far too late, what that trust had cost him. He thought about the look on that man's face in the last months. The bewilderment. The shame. The way he had moved through his own house in the final year as though he was already a ghost. On the fourth morning he called for his horse. Mart, who was working at the desk in the estate office when the Duke appeared in the doorway already dressed for riding, looked up from his papers with the expression of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment. "Bath," said the Duke. "The Belverton Crescent," said Mart. "Third house from the eastern end. Black door, window boxes. She takes her morning tea in the front parlour." Edmund looked at him for a moment. "How do you know she takes her tea in the front parlour?" "Her aunt and my sister attend the same church," said Mart, with perfect composure. "Safe journey, Your Grace." The road to Bath was long and grey and gave a man too much time to think, which Edmund did not need. He had been thinking for 4 days. He had thought himself into a corner and out of it again and into it again, and had arrived, finally, at the uncomfortable truth that the thinking was not the problem. The thinking was a way of avoiding the other thing, the thing that had nothing to do with settlement documents or estate accounts or the number at the bottom of the page. He arrived in Bath on a damp Thursday afternoon. The Belverton Crescent was quiet, a row of pale Georgian houses curved in a neat arc, window boxes bare in the November chill, the cobblestones wet from morning rain. He found the black door. He knocked. The maid who answered looked at him, at the tall dark man in the riding coat with the mud still drying on his boots, with an expression that was 1 part or in 2 parts alarm. He gave his name. She disappeared. He was left on the step for long enough to notice that someone inside the house was playing a pianoforte very quietly, and that the playing stopped the moment his name was announced. He was shown into the front parlour. Harriet was in the chair nearest the window. She had a book open in her lap. She looked up when he entered, and then she looked back down at her book, and she read for another 30 seconds in a silence so absolute he could hear the fire settle in the grate. Then she closed the book. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice gave him nothing. "Miss Fairfax." He stayed near the door, because crossing the room felt presumptuous, and he discovered, uncertain in a way he had not been uncertain since he was 22 years old and had first understood the full weight of everything his father had lost. "I owe you an apology." Her chin lifted slightly. She waited. "What I said to you in the hall," he continued, was—" He stopped. The prepared words were wrong. He had known they were wrong before he had finished constructing them, but he had brought them anyway as a kind of scaffolding, and now they were failing him. He set them aside. "I was not kind," he said. "What you did, coming here, that morning, alone, took considerable courage. I did not acknowledge it. I should have." Silence. The fire. A carriage passing on the crescent outside. "Is that the apology?" Harriet asked. "It is the beginning of one. Then I will hear the rest of it." He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside the window, a pair of pigeons argued briefly on the sill and then departed. "I need you to know," he said, slowly, "that what I am about to ask has nothing to do with the settlement documents. I understand that is precisely what you expect me to say, and I cannot make you believe it, and I am aware that the best I can offer you at this moment is the fact that I am standing in this room without my solicitor." Something shifted very slightly in Harriet's expression. Not warmth, exactly. Attention. The specific quality of attention that she gave, he would come to understand, to things she found genuinely interesting. "You came without Mr. Mart," she said. "I came without Mr. Mart." "That is," she said, after a brief pause, "marginally more compelling than I expected." She did not smile, but the line of her shoulders changed, barely, minutely, in a way that was not quite the same as the rigid composure she had worn on his doorstep 11 days ago. She closed her book fully and set it on the side table and looked at him with those winter-lake eyes. "Sit down, Your Grace," she said, "and tell me what you are actually proposing." He sat a day. He told her. He did not dress it in sentiment, because she would have seen through the sentiment, and he did not hide behind formality, because she had already watched him fail at that once. He told her the estate was in ruin. He told her he had courted Clara because Clara had been presented to him and he had done what the situation required without examining it closely enough. He told her, and this was the part that cost him something, he could feel it costing him as he said it, that the woman who had stood in his entrance hall 11 days ago and handed back a ring without a single crack in her composure was not someone he had forgotten. Was not, in fact, someone he was likely to forget. Harriet listened to all of this without interrupting. She listened the way she read, completely, carefully, missing nothing. When he finished, the room was very quiet. "I have 3 conditions," she said. He did not ask what the conditions were. Not immediately. He looked at her for a moment, this woman who had come to his house at dawn with someone else's letter and left his ring on a silver tray without a word of complaint, and he simply said, "Tell me." Harriet set her hands in her lap. She had the posture of someone who had rehearsed nothing and prepared everything. "First," she said, "I will have full access to the estate accounts. Not as a courtesy extended to me on patient days when you are in a generous mood. As a right, written into whatever agreement our solicitors draft. Every ledger, every correspondence, every outstanding obligation. I will not be managed around the difficult parts." He said nothing. She continued. "Second, when I speak in a room, I will be heard. Not tolerated. Not redirected to a more comfortable topic. Heard. I understand that this is not how things are generally arranged in houses like yours. I am telling you now that it is how they will be arranged in mine." The fire cracked behind her. Neither of them looked at it. "Third," she said, and here something in her voice shifted. Not softer, exactly, but more precise, the way a blade is more precise than a bludgeon. "If you ever again look at me the way you did that morning in your entrance hall, as though my existence in your house is an error to be corrected, I will leave. Not dramatically. Not with a scene. I will simply be gone. And I will not be retrieved a second time." The room was very still. Edmund looked at her across the small distance of the parlor and felt, with uncomfortable clarity, that he was being shown the full terms of a negotiation most men would never have thought to conduct. She was not asking for affection. She was not asking for promises. She was asking for a specific quality of respect, the kind that could not be performed on good days and quietly withdrawn on difficult ones, and she was telling him, in plain language, that she would know the difference. "Agreed," he said. "All 3. Harriet studied him for a moment. Then she reached for the bell pull beside her chair and rang for the maid. "I will need 2 days to arrange my things," she said, returning to her ordinary tone as though they had been discussing nothing more consequential than a journey timetable. "And you will write to my father before I do. Whatever you say to him is your business. But he will hear from you first." "Understood." The maid appeared. Harriet asked for fresh tea with the serenity of a woman who had just negotiated the terms of her own life and found the outcome acceptable. From the doorway of the parlor, her aunt, a small, bright-eyed woman named Mrs. Pemberton who had said not one word since the Duke's arrival, watched all of this with an expression of profound satisfaction. She retreated before anyone noticed her. In the hallway she pressed both hands to her mouth and allowed herself a single, silent moment of delight. Then she went to write a very long letter to her sister. Blackmere House received Harriet on a Tuesday morning in November, under a sky the color of cold pewter. She came with one trunk, the leather satchel, and her aunt's maid as temporary chaperone until Mrs. Pemberton herself could follow at the end of the week. Mrs. Hollis met her at the door with a ring of household keys and the expression of someone offering a drowning man a rope. Harriet took the keys. She held them the way she held everything, as though she had always been meant to have them. She spent the first 2 hours walking the house. Not the formal rooms, she would come to those, but the working parts. The kitchen. The larder. The linen cupboard. The state of the east wing, which she discovered quite by accident when she pushed open a door at the end of the second-floor corridor and felt cold air move against her face from 20 feet of damaged ceiling. She stood in the doorway and looked at it without expression for a long moment. Then she closed the door, noted the location in her journal, and continued. By the end of the first day she had a list. It was not a short list. She brought it to the estate study that evening after dinner. The dinner had been a quiet affair, the Duke at one end of the long table, Harriet at the other, conversation careful and somewhat architectural, and she spread it on the desk without preamble. Edmund looked at the list. He looked at Harriet. She was still in her dinner dress, a deep green silk that made her look, in the lamplight, considerably less manageable than she had appeared in the parlour at Bath. "The East Wing," she said, tapping a line on the list, "cannot wait another winter. The roof damage is already spreading to the structural timbers above the second bedroom. If it is not addressed by spring, the entire section will be unsalvageable. I know about the East Wing." "Then you know it has been left for," she glanced at the notes beside the entry, "at minimum 6 years. Probably longer. The funds were not available." "Some of them will be now," she said, without triumph, without softness. "I would like to look at the full accounts in the morning. Not the summary Mart prepared. The original ledgers." He was quiet for a moment. Not resistant. She watched him carefully, and it was not resistance she saw in his face. It was something closer to the particular discomfort of a man being seen in a house he has managed in shame for a very long time. "They are in the bottom cabinet," he said. "Left drawer." "Thank you." She rolled her list back up and stood. "Good night, Your Grace." "Blackmere," he said, before he thought about it. She paused at the door, turned slightly. "I beg your pardon." "Edmund," he said. "Or Blackmere. Either." A pause. "Your Grace is what tenants call me." Harriet looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not yet read. She had several he could not yet read, and he was beginning to catalogue them, and then she said, "Good night, Blackmere," and left. He sat in the study for another hour. He did not touch the accounts. He looked at the left drawer of the bottom cabinet, and then he looked at the door through which she had exited, and then, for the first time in a very long time, the number at the bottom of the page did not feel like the only thing in the room. The ledgers did not lie. They never did. That was the thing about numbers that Harriet had understood since she was 14 years old, sitting in her grandfather's study in Wiltshire. They were the one thing in a gentleman's household that could not be charmed, redirected, or politely misled. They simply sat on the page and told the truth, and the truth of Blackmere's accounts was worse than she had anticipated and better than it could have been, which meant it was exactly the kind of situation that responded to methodical intervention. She worked every morning in the estate study. She began at 7, before the Duke came down, and she was always still there when he arrived. The first morning he stopped in the doorway and looked at her, spread papers, 2 open ledgers, the ink already on her right index finger from the annotations she had been making since dawn, and said nothing. He moved to the far end of the desk, opened his own correspondence, and began working. They did not speak for 40 minutes. It was the most comfortable 40 minutes Harriet had spent in the company of another person in recent memory. By the end of the first week she had identified 3 redundant debt obligations that had been counted twice in the annual summaries, a rent roll error in the northern tenancies that had been costing the estate £60 annually for at least a decade, and a set of investment returns from an estate trust that Mart had never flagged because they were buried in a section of the accounts mislabeled, through carelessness, she assumed, as charitable expenditure. She brought these findings to the Duke on a Friday afternoon when the light was already failing and the first fire of the evening had been lit. She did not present them as victories. She laid them out plainly, explained the correction required for each, and asked for his authorization to write the relevant letters. Edmund read her notes. He read them slowly, and then he read them again, and when he finally looked up there was an expression on his face that she had not seen there before, not gratitude exactly, because he was not a man who wore gratitude easily, but something adjacent to it. Something that acknowledged, without announcement, that a thing he had not known how to fix had been fixed. "The rent roll error," he said. "Mart never caught it." "It was in the 3rd volume of a 4-volume series," Harriet said. "Most people stop at 2. You read all 4. I read all 4. A pause. In 3 days. They are not long volumes." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, the ghost of one, the structural outline of one, and looked back at the notes. Harriet filed this away in the catalogue she was quietly keeping, things she had learned about the Duke of Blackmere. He did not laugh, or had not until recently. He rose before 5. He took his coffee without sugar. He rode the estate boundaries every other morning regardless of weather. He had read every book in the library and annotated almost none of them, which she found curious until she realized he remembered everything he read and had no need of annotations. He was sharp. He was careful. He was the loneliest person she had ever encountered in a house full of staff, and he appeared to be entirely unaware of it. She was aware of it. She was, she told herself firmly, going to be professionally aware of it and nothing further. The books were an accident. She had simply been looking for a text on drainage engineering, relevant to the East Wing repairs, and had found it on the third shelf wedged between a volume of Greek philosophy and what appeared to be an atlas of the Ottoman Empire. She had pulled it out, and with it had come a slender volume that fell open on the floor to a page near the end, and she had picked it up and glanced down and read 3 sentences before she realized she was reading something in which someone had made extensive marginal notes. The handwriting was his. She recognized it from the correspondence she had been processing. Small, dark, precise, and in the margins of this particular text, which was a political philosophy she had read herself at 19 and found both brilliant and deeply aggravating, the notes were not summaries. They were arguments. Running arguments with the author, conducted in 4 different inks across what appeared to be several years, furious and specific and occasionally quite funny. She sat down on the library floor with the book in her lap and read every margin before she noticed she had been in the library for 2 hours. She put the book back. She found the drainage text. She told herself it was irrelevant. That evening at dinner the Duke mentioned, with no particular context, that he had always found Godwin's position on rational benevolence philosophically convenient but empirically useless, and Harriet set down her fork and looked at him across the 20 feet of dining table and said, "I have thought so since I was 19 and I have never heard anyone else say it." The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. It had a different quality, alert, surprised, the way a room feels when a window is opened unexpectedly and the air changes. "You've read Godwin," he said. "I've argued with Godwin," she corrected. "There is a distinction." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "The dining table is absurd. Will you move down here?" and gestured to the chair immediately to his right. She moved. They talked until the candles burned low enough that Mrs. Hollis appeared in the doorway with an expression that was 1 part propriety and 2 parts pure happiness, and reminded them both, with enormous delicacy, that it was nearly 11. Harriet went to bed that night with ink on her fingers and an unfamiliar feeling in her chest that she diagnosed, firmly, as intellectual satisfaction and left at that. 3 days later they had their first argument. It began over Edmund Burke. She had been reading his volume in the library, had found one of the Duke's marginal notes and written a response to it in a different ink directly beneath, and had replaced the book with calm deliberation. He found it the following morning. He came to the study at 8:10 with the book in his hand and an expression that was not quite outrage but was certainly in the same neighborhood. "You wrote in my book," he said. "I responded to your argument," she said, without looking up from the ledger she was working on. "Your note was wrong. I corrected it." It is my book." It was a poor argument. It deserved correction. He opened the book to the page. He read her response. A muscle moved in his jaw. "This is not a correction. It is a prosecution. It is a counter-argument." Now she looked up. A correction would have been 1 line. "Your position required more." "My position," he said, pulling the opposite chair out and sitting down with the book, "is that Burke's conception of natural aristocracy is not a defense of inherited privilege but a recognition that. That is precisely what a man who inherited a dukedom would say. That is precisely the kind of argument that avoids engaging with the actual text. I engaged with the actual text. I cited 4 passages. Your original note cited 1 and misread it. I did not misread it. I interpreted it in context. In the context that suited your conclusion." He stared at her. She looked back at him with those pale eyes perfectly steady and her quill still in her ink-stained hand, and for a moment the study was very loud with things that were not being said. "Page 47, he said, opening the book and pushing it across the desk. "Read it again." She read it. He watched her read it. He watched her reach the end of the passage, and then go back to the top and read it again, and he watched the precise moment, Visible, he was sure, only to him at this specific distance, when she found the thing that complicated her argument. She did not concede. She modified. "You are not entirely wrong," she said, with the air of someone paying a customs duty. "But you are not as right as your original note suggested." "I will accept that," he said. "You ought to accept it gracefully. It is more than you deserve." He did smile then. Not the ghost of one, a real one, brief and entirely unguarded, transforming his face in the way that made Mrs. Hollis, who happened to be passing the study doorway at that exact moment with a pile of fresh linens, nearly drop the entire stack. She carried the linens to the upper landing and sat down on the top step and pressed her hand to her heart. Above the study, in the attic, the east wing waited with its damaged roof and its spreading damp and its 15-year accumulation of things left unaddressed. In the kitchen, the cook was making her first proper roast in 3 months because there was, for the first time in longer than she could remember, enough money in the household account to justify it. In the estate office, Mart had received Harriet's 3 corrective letters and was reading them with his spectacles perched on his nose and the expression of a man who is extremely pleased and is doing his professional best not to show it. And in the study, Edmund Ashby, Duke of Blackmere, was annotating the margin of a book in a new ink, beside a response from the woman sitting 4 feet away from him who was already back at her ledger, and what he was writing in that margin was not, strictly speaking, about Edmund Burke at all. 6 weeks in, on a grey Tuesday, Harriet found the letters. She was working through the East Cabinet, the one that nobody had properly organised since the 7th Duke's time, the one that still smelled faintly of his tobacco, and she was doing so with her usual methodical patience, working from the bottom drawer upward, opening folders, cataloguing contents, setting aside anything that required the Duke's attention. It was slow work. It was the kind of work that required the specific type of concentration that blocked out everything else, which was why she almost missed it. Almost. The folder was mislabeled. It said Charitable Disbursements 1798 to 1800 on the outside, and it was tucked at the very back of the 3rd drawer behind 3 other folders that contained exactly what they claimed to contain. She pulled it out because she pulled everything out. She opened it because she opened everything. She read the first letter because it was there to be read. Then she read it again. Then she sat very still in the chair behind the estate desk with the folder in her hands and the fire going low behind her and the room growing cold around her, and she read every letter in the folder, one by one, slowly, to the end. There were 11 of them. They spanned 8 months. They were between a man named Crail, the Duke's father's former business partner, the man who had vanished to the continent with the Blackmere fortune, and a second correspondent whose name Harriet recognized immediately, because it was the name of a man who had been at the Pembridge ball, who had bowed to Clara across the supper room, who sat in the House of Lords and was received in every great house in England and had been, for 15 years, entirely above suspicion. The letters were careful. They were written in the language of men who knew they were constructing evidence and had tried very hard to obscure it. But they were not written carefully enough for someone who had been reading financial documents since she was 14 and who had learned, from years of managing a chaotic household, that the most important information in any correspondence was never what was said but what was left conspicuously out. She closed the folder. She stood up. She went to find the Duke.
If this story has its grip on you, and we think it does, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what you think is going to happen next. Your support keeps stories like this coming, and we promise you, what happens in the final part of this story will leave you absolutely breathless.
He was in the stable yard. She could hear him before she saw him, his voice low and even, speaking to the head groom about the condition of the north pasture fence. The kind of conversation that meant nothing was wrong and everything was manageable and the world was still in its ordinary order. She crossed the yard in her half-boots without stopping, without calling out, without any of the hesitation she might have allowed herself if she had thought about it long enough. The cobblestones were wet from the morning's rain. She did not look down. He turned when he heard her footsteps. He took one look at her face and said something brief to the groom, who vanished with the particular efficiency of a man who has worked for the Duke long enough to know when to disappear. Harriet held the folder out. He looked at it. He looked at her. He took it. He read standing in the stable yard with the cold November air moving between them and the smell of hay and rain and horse around them, and she watched his face the way she had watched it that first morning in the entrance hall, carefully, completely, missing nothing. She watched him reach the end of the first letter and go back to the beginning. She watched him move to the second. She watched the color leave his face in the way that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with something fundamental shifting beneath a person's understanding of their own life. He read all 11 letters. It took a long time. Neither of them moved. When he finally looked up, his eyes were very dark and very still, and the muscle in his jaw was doing the thing she had learned meant he was holding something at a distance that very much wanted to be closer. Viscount Hearn, he said. The name came out flat and quiet, which was worse than if he had shouted it. Yes, she said. He was at my father's funeral. She had not known that. She absorbed it without expression. He gave the eulogy, Edmund said. His voice had gone somewhere very controlled and very cold. He stood at the pulpit and spoke about my father's character. His integrity. He stopped. His hand, holding the folder, tightened. Harriet said nothing. There was nothing to say that the letters had not already said with more precision than anything she could offer. She simply stood in front of him in the wet stable yard and let him feel the full weight of it, because he deserved to feel it properly, and because she understood, in a way she could not have articulated, that what he needed from her in this moment was not comfort. It was witness. After a long while he said, "You found this in the East Cabinet. Third drawer. Mislabeled folder. Deliberately." Yes. Close enough to be found eventually. Far enough to require someone who actually looked. She paused. Someone put those letters there, Blackmere. Not to destroy them. If they had wanted them destroyed, they would have burned them 15 years ago. They put them there to hold. As insurance. Which means Hearn knew they existed, he said. And knew where they were. And left them there because a crumbling estate managed by an overworked duke with no help and no reason to reorganize a cabinet from 1798 was the safest filing system in England. He looked at her. The full force of it, what she had found, what it meant, what it cost to say plainly, crossed his face in one unguarded moment and then was controlled again. But she had seen it. She always saw it. "We need Mart," she said. "Yes." "Tonight." "Yes." He closed the folder. He held it with both hands for a moment, looking down at it, and then he looked up at the sky above the stable yard, grey and flat and entirely indifferent, and he exhaled, slow and long. Then he looked at her. And what was in his face then was not the frost, not the calculation, not the careful management of a man who had been holding everything at arm's length for 15 years. It was something much older and much simpler. It was the face of a man who had been carrying something alone for a very long time and had just discovered, without planning for it, that he was not carrying it alone anymore. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She nodded, once, and turned and walked back across the wet cobblestones toward the house. Behind her, she heard him follow. Mart arrived at 9 o'clock that evening with his leather case and his spectacles and the expression of a man who had received a one-line note from the Duke reading only "Come tonight, bring everything," and had known, with the certainty of long experience, that everything had changed. He sat at the estate desk and read the 11 letters twice. Then he removed his spectacles, cleaned them with his handkerchief, replaced them, and sat back. "Hearn," he said. "Yes," said Edmund. A silence. Then Mart said, "He was at the Pembridge ball." "I am aware." "He danced with Miss Fairfax." He glanced at Harriet, who was seated in the chair beside the fire with her hands folded and her face composed. The elder Miss Fairfax. Before the elopement. Something moved through the room. Harriet felt it before she understood it, a cold thread of something pulling tight between 2 points. "He knew the marriage was being arranged," she said slowly. "He knew a union between Blackmere and the Fairfax fortune would give the Duke the resources to begin asking questions," Edmund said. He was standing at the window, his back to the room, his reflection dark in the glass. A financially restored Blackmere with a capable wife and a reason to look at old records. He turned. He needed Clara gone. The room was very quiet. "He arranged the elopement," Harriet said. "Not a question." "He arranged the poet," Edmund said. "The introduction. The opportunity. The convenient open window." Clara thought she was following her heart. His voice was careful and precise and cost him something. She was being moved. Harriet stood up. She did it without drama, simply rising from the chair and crossing to the desk, where she picked up her own notes, the timeline she had been constructing quietly in her journal while Mart read the letters, and set them beside the folder. "Then we do not move slowly," she said. "If Hearn has been watching this estate, he knows I am here. He knows the accounts are being reorganized. He does not yet know about the letters, because if he did he would have acted already. Which means we have a window." She looked at Mart. "How quickly can you get these to the Home Office?" Mart looked at her notes. He looked at the folder. He looked at Edmund, who was watching Harriet with an expression that Mart, who had known Edmund Ashby since he was 16 years old, had never seen on his face before. "If I leave before dawn," Mart said, "I can be in London by afternoon." "Leave before dawn," said Harriet. Mart allowed himself one small, private smile. He picked up his pen and began to write. Mart left at 4 in the morning. Edmund stood at the door and watched the carriage lights disappear down the drive and then stood there for a while longer in the cold with the door open behind him, because the house felt loud in the way that houses feel loud when something enormous has just been set in motion and cannot be stopped. Harriet appeared at his shoulder with a candle and a blanket she had taken from the hall chair, which she held out without comment. He looked at it. He looked at her. "You will freeze," she said. "I am fine. You are standing in an open doorway in November without a coat." He took the blanket. He did not put it around his shoulders, he held it, which was not the same thing, but she accepted this as approximately the best outcome available and said nothing. They stood together at the open door and watched the dark drive and the dark oaks and the dark sky above them beginning, at its very furthest edge, to consider the possibility of dawn. "My father trusted everyone," Edmund said. He said it the way people say things they have thought 10,000 times but never said aloud, carefully, as if testing whether words can hold the weight. It was not stupidity. He was a genuinely good man, and genuinely good men tend to extend the assumption of goodness to others. Hearn understood that. He positioned himself as exactly the kind of man my father would trust, and then he stopped. "He was patient," Harriet said quietly. "Men like Hearn are always patient. The patience is the strategy." A long pause. "You are not like that," he said. He was not looking at her. "You do not extend the assumption. You watch first." "I learned to watch first." "From what?" She was quiet for a moment. The candle flame moved in the cold air from the open door. "From being the one nobody watched," she said. "When you are Clara's sister, you become very good at observing rooms. Nobody is looking at you. You can see everything." He turned to look at her then. In the candlelight she was all shadow and pale eyes and dark hair coming loose from its pins because it was 4 in the morning and nobody pins their hair properly at 4 in the morning. "I looked at you," he said. She met his eyes. "Not at first." "No," he said. "Not at first." A pause. "I have been making up for it." The darkness outside was beginning to grey at the tree line. Somewhere in the oaks, a single bird tried one tentative note and then thought better of it. "Go to sleep, Blackmere," she said, and took the candle back, and went inside. He stood at the door for another minute. Then he smiled, the real one, the transformative one, at the empty drive, and followed her in. What followed in the next 3 weeks was the kind of thing that the history books record in dry official language and completely fail to capture. Mart delivered the letters to a contact at the Home Office who delivered them to someone else who delivered them to the precise desk where such things produced the most immediate and irreversible results. Hearn was quietly asked certain questions. Crail, tracked to a villa outside Toulouse through correspondence chains that the Home Office had apparently been half following for years without the missing piece that Harriet's 11 letters supplied, was considerably less quiet about his answers when the questions were put to him officially. The whole thing broke across London on a Wednesday morning in December, and it broke completely. Edmund and Harriet were in the estate study when Mart arrived with the London papers and a letter from the Home Office. He set both on the desk without speaking. Edmund read the letter first, then the papers. Harriet read them after. The story was on the front page. Viscount Hearn. The Blackmere estate. 15 years. The name of his father, restored in print to exactly the dignity it had always deserved. Harriet finished reading and set the paper down with great care, as though it was something that might break. "It is done," Mart said. Edmund was standing very still. He was looking at a specific line in the paper. She could not see which one from where she sat, but she could see what it was doing to his face, the way the careful architecture of control was under pressure that was not grief and not relief, but the specific combination of both that has no name and requires no audience. She stood up. She did not touch him. She crossed to the window and looked out at the estate, the drive, the oaks, the east wing with its damaged roof that was already being assessed by two men from the village who had been recommended by the head groom, and she gave him the room and the quiet to feel it privately, which was the most intimate thing she could have done. After a while he said, "Harriet." She turned. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I was reorganizing the East Cabinet." "Yes," he said. "You were." And his voice when he said it contained something she had never heard in it before, something that had nothing to do with estates or accounts or 15-year-old betrayals, something that was entirely and specifically about her. She turned back to the window. Her hands, clasped behind her back, tightened briefly. "The East Wing repairs will take until March," she said, in her ordinary voice. "I have had the surveyor's estimate revised. It will cost less than Mart projected." "Of course it will," he said. And this time she could hear, without looking, that he was smiling. London did what London does with a scandal of this magnitude. It consumed it entirely, discussed it exhaustively, and then pivoted to the secondary story, which was the question of the Duke of Blackmere and his unexpected choice of bride. Drawing rooms that had spent the summer season being very knowing about the Duke's courtship of the eldest Fairfax daughter now found themselves recalibrating with some urgency. The wrong Miss Fairfax. The bookish one. The one who had apparently walked into a crumbling estate with a leather satchel and reorganized it from the foundations up, found a 15-year-old criminal conspiracy in a mislabeled cabinet drawer, and in the process restored the Blackmere name to a standing it had not enjoyed since before most of the current ton had been out of the schoolroom. The ton was, privately, rather impressed. Publicly, it asked a great many questions. Clara wrote from Edinburgh. The letter arrived in December, forwarded through 3 addresses, slightly crumpled and smelling faintly of Scottish heather. It was long and disorganized and very Clara. She expressed remorse in 6 different ways without quite apologizing, described the Scottish poet in terms that made him sound like a figure from a romantic novel, and asked, in the final paragraph, with an earnestness that was the most genuine thing in the letter, whether Harriet was well. Whether she was happy. Harriet read the letter twice. Then she sat down and wrote back, and she was honest, which was the only way she knew how to be, and what she said in that letter was that she was managing very well, that Blackmere was not what she had anticipated, and that the man she was to marry was, and here she paused over the word for a long moment before she wrote it, extraordinary. In the specific way that things which have been tested and survived the testing are extraordinary. She sealed the letter. She did not reread it. She gave it to the footman and went back to her ledgers. The proposal happened on an evening in late December when the library fire was high and the house was quiet, and the snow that had been threatening all day had finally begun to fall outside the tall windows, soundless and absolute. Harriet was standing at the shelves with her back to the room, running her finger along the spines the way she did when she was not looking for anything specific but simply finding comfort in the proximity of books. She heard him come in. She knew his step. She had known it for weeks, the particular weight and rhythm of it, the way it slowed when he was thinking and quickened when something on the estate demanded attention. This step was different. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the library with a look on his face that she had never seen before. Not the frost. Not the calculation. Not the brief, transformative smile. This was something underneath all of those things, something that had been there for weeks, she understood now, building in the margins of arguments and quiet mornings and 4 a.m. doorways, and had now arrived at the surface and had nowhere left to go. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. And then he did something she did not anticipate. He did not speak first. He simply looked at her, completely and without strategy, the way she had been looking at him since the very beginning. Then he went down on one knee on the library floor between the shelves. She looked down at him. Her chest was doing something she had no professional category for and no intention of naming in the immediate term. Her hands, at her sides, were very still. "You will have to say the words properly," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "I handed the last ring back." I should like to remember this one differently. He reached into his coat pocket. He held up the ring, not the original ring, she realized. Not the Blackmere engagement ring that had sat on the silver letter tray in the entrance hall. This was different. Smaller. A dark stone she did not immediately recognize, set simply, in a band without ornamentation. It was my mother's, he said. She left it to me. She said, a brief pause, she said to give it to someone who would not need the diamonds. Harriet looked at the ring. She looked at him. Something moved across her face that was not composure and not its absence but something entirely new. Edmund, he said. You said you would call me Edmund. I said I would call you Blackmere. Call me Edmund, he said, and say yes. She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that he remained where he was without moving, which cost him something visible, and which she noted and did not prolong beyond what was necessary. Long enough that the snow outside the window accumulated another half-inch on the sill. Long enough that the fire settled behind them with a sound like a punctuation mark. Ask me properly, she said. Every word. He asked her. Every word. He did not rush it. He said things that were not in any conventional proposal she had ever heard described, things that were entirely specific to her, to the ink on her finger and the arguments in the margins and the East Cabinet and 4 in the morning and the way she had stood in his stable yard in the rain and held out 11 letters that gave him back 15 years. He said her name, which she had heard him say before but not like this, not with all of the scaffolding down. When he finished the room was very quiet. Harriet reached out and took the ring from his hand. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Then she looked at him, this man who had called her the wrong thing on a terrible morning and had spent every day since proving that he knew the difference, and something in her face opened in a way it had never quite opened before. Not the composure. Not the watchfulness. Something underneath both, something that had been waiting since she was 17 years old in a room where nobody was looking at her. Yes, she said. He rose. He took the ring from her hand and placed it on her finger, and then he held her hand in both of his and did not let go, and her hand trembled, once, briefly, the only unguarded thing she had permitted herself since the morning she had walked out of his front door, and he felt it and he held it steady. They stood between the shelves with the snow falling beyond the windows and the fire behind them and the books around them, and neither of them spoke, because everything that needed to be said had been said, and the rest was simply this, 2 people standing in a warm room, holding on. The ton would talk for the rest of the season. They would discuss the wrong Miss Fairfax and the mislabeled cabinet and the viscount's disgrace and the Scottish poet and the extraordinary business with the Home Office, and they would debate, in drawing rooms from Mayfair to Bath, how the Duke of Blackmere had ended up engaged to the second daughter. Mart, when asked his opinion on the matter at his sister's card evening in January, removed his spectacles, cleaned them with his handkerchief, replaced them, and said simply that the Duke had ended up with the right one, and that anyone who had spent 10 minutes in the same room as Miss Harriet Fairfax would understand this without requiring further explanation. Mrs. Hollis, who had watched all of it from doorways and corridors and the top of the second-floor landing, said nothing to anyone. She simply went about her work in a house that was warmer now in every sense, with a staff that had stopped walking quietly around the edges of rooms, in halls that smelled of fresh wax and coal fires that were no longer rationed, and she said her small private prayers in the morning the way she always had, and added, at the end, a line of gratitude so specific and so sincere that she suspected God would know exactly what she meant. And Harriet, Miss Harriet Fairfax of Wiltshire, second daughter, the wrong girl, the one nobody had been watching, sat in the estate study of Blackmere House on a January morning with the accounts open before her and ink on her finger and her mother's ring on her hand, and outside the window the snow was thawing and the east wing repairs were 3 weeks underway, and somewhere in the house she could hear Edmund's step on the stairs, unhurried, coming her way. She did not look up when he came in. She finished her line. Then she reached out and pushed the second chair slightly away from the desk, just enough, without looking. He sat down. He opened his correspondence. They worked in the particular silence that belongs only to people who have found, in each other, a place where silence is allowed to be comfortable. After 20 minutes he said, without looking up, "You have added another annotation to the Burke. Your original argument still requires correction. My original argument was perfectly sound. Your original argument was the intellectual equivalent of the East Wing before I arrived." He looked up. She was still writing. The corner of her mouth, just barely, was doing something. "Harriet," he said. "Blackmere," she said. Edmund. She looked up. Those pale grey-green eyes, steady and sharp and entirely themselves. Edmund, she said, and went back to her ledger. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he went back to his correspondence. Outside, the snow continued to thaw. The east wing stood a little straighter. The oaks along the drive, stripped to their winter bones, held the pale January light in their branches like something they intended to keep.
If this story moved you, if you stayed until the very last word, then you already know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below telling us your favorite moment from this entire tale. Was it the ring on the silver tray? The margins of the book? The 11 letters in the rain? Tell us, we read every single one. And if you know someone who deserves a story this good today, share it with them. We'll see you in the next one.